Chapter. Hoy tenemos interpretación en inglés o en español.
Good morning, everyone. Today we have interpretation into English and Spanish. So please go into the lower part of your screen so you can choose the language of your preference.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I'm very glad to have you here today and have you join our peer forum. Today's peer forum is on, oh, there we go. Today's peer forum is about successfully accessing the different sources of funding, particularly from a states and regional perspective. We will be using Zoom for today's meeting. So at the bottom of your screen, please have a look that you keep your video on. We would like to see, or we'd like to know who's in the room. Please do keep yourself muted so far until the breakout rooms, when we'll invite you to speak, where there's a space for you to talk with your colleagues. And we'll be using the chat function to talk to each other and for the introductions later on. And for now, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Farial Rohail, who's the project manager for the Climate Footprint Project at the Climate Group. Farial, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julianne. Good morning and good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Farial Rohail, and I am the project manager for the Climate Footprint Project Phase 2. On behalf of Climate Group and the Under 2 Coalition, I welcome you all to the third Peer Forum of the second phase of Tracking to Action Peer Forum series. The Climate Footprint Project is an initiative of the Under 2 Coalition, which is the largest global network of states and regional governments committed to reducing their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. The Climate Footprint Project supports state and regional governments to improve their greenhouse gas emissions tracking and reduction efforts. This project is funded by the German government through the International Climate Initiative Program. In terms of the project, consortium, we have Climate Group, who is the project lead. Then we have Ricardo Energy and the Environment, who are the lead technical partner on the project. Then we also have 5 in-country implementing partners, 1 in each project country. And then finally, we have EdgeFX, who are facilitating this Peer Forum series. Next slide, please. So in terms of the second phase of the project, we are delivering this project in 5 countries, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, India, and South Africa. And we are working very closely with 10 states and regional governments in these project countries. When we started the second phase of the project in January this year, we undertook a detailed technical scoping exercise to understand the needs of the participating states. So even though the focus of this project is to strengthen the capacities of the states around MRV and GHG emission inventories, however, some of the requests that were put forward by the participating states were beyond these focus areas. For example, some of the states requested us if we could provide them technical support on climate finance, climate adaptation, vertical integration, and climate action planning. And so we have designed this Peer Forum series around these focus areas. And some of you who have already taken part in the first and the second Peer Forum might have noticed that we delivered the first Peer Forum on adaptation tracking, and then we did the second Peer Forum on stakeholder engagement in states' climate actions. And today we are going to focus on climate finance. And so through this series, we are basically trying to bring in a diversity of different topics. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the objectives of this project, we have 3 main goals. So the first objective is to deliver 10 tailored technical interventions to the participating states and regions. And this work is led by Ricardo Energy and Environment in partnership with the local implementing partners. The second objective is to align regional efforts with the national climate action plans. And we have been doing this through the technical interventions and also through this Peer Forum series. And finally, we will be sharing the best practices and lessons learned from this project with the wider Under 2 community through the Peer Forum series and also through the development of knowledge products. And we are aiming to publish the knowledge products later in October. So you'll have a chance to have a look at that once they are out. So this is a brief overview of the project. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, you can see my contact details. And if you have any questions on the project, please feel free to get in touch and I'll be happy to get back to you. I'll now hand over to Julianne to begin with the peer forum. Thank you so much for taking part.
Right, fantastic, Faria, for this welcome. And yes, so today's peer forum really is about giving you as participants a bit of space to explore what's the breadth of the different sources of finance and what are some of the approaches that we can use to strengthen the bankability of adaptation or mitigation projects that are all in service of implementing more ambitious climate actions. So this peer forum today really is an opportunity for you to hear about the experience and also the approach of the government of Gauteng and the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, GDART, how they worked on to strengthen the bankability of one of their waste management projects. It's also an opportunity to gain greater insights and better understanding of the different sources of finance that are available, what some of the funders' requirements are, and what might be some of the questions that you want to think about, especially when you're exploring how to strengthen the kind of funding application that you have. And finally, we also have created this as a space for you to start identifying and thinking about recommendations or suggestions, how to strengthen the bankability of a real life project proposal, but I will tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So yeah, today really is a space for you to learn a bit more, but also try to come up with some recommendations and ideas. And what we're proposing, how to spend our time together, we've got 90 minutes in total together. What we'll be doing is starting with a check-in and a welcome right now. We will then have a presentation. We have two presentations. One is about the kind of landscape of climate finance, and that will be delivered by one of our speakers, Sandra Guzman Luna, who is the founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, GFLAC, which is the Spanish abbreviation. And then we also have a second speaker with us, Loiso Nkwana, who's the Chief Director of the Gauteng Department for Agriculture and Rural Development, GDART, in South Africa. And he's going to present the Gauteng case study. So to hear a little bit more about a waste management project that they've developed in Gauteng for the state of Gauteng, and to give that as a challenge or as a case study for you as participants. We'll then spend a little bit of time in breakout rooms to have a discussion about what some of the recommendations or suggestions might be for the government of Gauteng on how they could increase the bankability of their waste management project. We'll then spend a little bit of time hearing back in plenary a bit of the feedback from those breakout room discussions and what some of those suggestions were. And we'll also hear from Loiso what actually happened and what some of the changes were that they took to strengthen the bankability of their project. We'll then finish with a checkout and a quick round of feedback. And that's how we're proposing to spend our time together. So there's a little bit of time for you to listen, but then there's also time to get involved and actively speak with one another. But maybe that's enough speaking for now from my side. And I'd love to hear who's in the room. So I welcome you all to go to the chat function and please introduce yourselves. So please write your name, where you're calling from, the state or the country or the region, and what are you hoping to learn about accessing different sources of funding. I can see some people have already started introducing themselves, which is great. I can see that there's colleagues from Mexico and from Brazil who are calling. Bon dia, bienvenido. I can also see that we've got more colleagues from South Africa who are calling from GDART. We have Lerato. Great, fantastic. We have colleagues from Jalisco, from Mexico calling, and also from KwaZulu-Natal, who are part of the project states with the first phase of the climate footprint project. Great, we've got Jebby from the Under 2 Coalition, who's also was really looking forward to understand a little bit more the link between accountability and climate finance. So hopefully we'll be getting into that a little bit more into our conversations. I can see that our colleagues from Brazil are also very present in the Sphere Forum. So very nice to have you here on the call and welcome. Let's see. Great. We've got another colleague from Brazil, from the state of Rio de Janeiro calling, and they're supporting the state and fundraising and have been working very closely with their environment secretary. So the environment secretariat. So yeah, I think that'll be really interesting to hear how that works. Welcome, Samantha from Pernambuco, who'd like to learn a little bit more about how to improve the access to funding. So again, hopefully we'll be going into that and learning a little bit more about that and what some of the approaches might be for preparing and obtaining climate finance. Great, thank you so much for those introductions. Please feel free to have a look through who else is in the room as we slowly continue. But with that, I think we're actually ready to start going into the presentations and hearing a little bit more from our two speakers. And I'm going to hand over to them in a minute, but just to let you know, if you have any questions to the speakers, please feel free to capture your questions in the chat. And if we have time, we might be able to address them. Otherwise, you can also take them into your breakout room conversations, or we'll address them in our follow-up email. But with that, I'm going to stop and introduce our next speaker, Sandra Guzman Luna, who's the founder of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. GFLAC is the name in Spanish, abbreviated. And Sandra has a very rich experience of over 16 years in climate policy and climate finance and climate negotiations. She was a manager of climate finance at the Climate Policy Initiative, and has also worked as a consultant for the Standing Committee of the Climate Finance at the UNFCCC. And she's worked formerly as a General Director of Climate Change Policies at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources in Mexico. Now, with that, Sandra, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you to hear a little bit more from you about the landscape of climate finance.
Thank you so much, Julianne, and thanks a lot, colleagues, for inviting me to this important session. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it. Perfect. Awesome. Thanks a lot. Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you again for the invitation. It is great to talk to you. And I think one of the big challenges around the world is not only understanding the climate finance landscape, but particularly understanding what are the challenges and the recommendations to really unlock the access to these financial flows. So I'm going to talk about that. I have 10 minutes, so I hope to be able to cover all the points. Allow me to start with this graph. Maybe some of you know this landscape on climate finance. The Climate Policy Initiative has been producing an analysis of what's the status of climate finance around the world. And this is just like a snapshot, or where is the money, where the money is coming from. And I think this is just to open the conversation. According to CPI in 2019 and 2020, there was a mobilization of around $632 billion. And obviously there are a lot of channels that have been used to do this mobilization. We are talking not only about public sources, but also about private sources. For instance, when we discuss elements about public sources, we talk not only about the national development finance institutions, we also talk about multilateral development financial institutions, such as the multilateral development banks. And we also talk about other multilateral mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund and others. But lately, the climate finance has been also mobilized through private mechanisms, and there is a growing number of instruments and mechanisms that have been participating in the mobilization of these resources. So, however, as you can imagine, some of the critical elements when we try to understand the landscape, one of the critical elements is the transparency. To what extent this picture really captures the reality. We know that there are a lot of information missing, but this is just to give you an idea that money is out there, and the critical element is how to access and how to make use of these resources in an effective way. This is just to show you that yes, there is an incremental, there is every time there are more financial flows going around. However, one of the discussions that has been very present in developing countries, not only in central governments, but also in local governments, is how to access to these resources and how to ensure that all these climate finance flows are arriving to where is needed. When we refer to the climate finance architecture, particularly related to the public sources, it is interesting to differentiate those financial mechanisms or financial schemes that have been created at the bilateral level from the multilateral level. This is relevant because at the international, when we talk in the context of the UNCCC, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, we differentiate those mechanisms that have been created for bilateral relationships, for instance, through governments such as Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, Norway. There are several schemes that have been created at the bilateral level. And also there are other mechanisms that have been created at the multilateral level. Some of them are in the context of the UNCCC. For instance, you may know the case of the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund, or even the Global Environmental Facility. But lately, there is more and more interest on the mechanisms that have been created also outside of the UNCCC. For instance, you may know the case of the climate investment funds that are these mechanisms that are trying to capture, trying to generate partnerships between different entities to unlock or to accelerate the mobilization of financial flows. It is really difficult to go in depth in each of these, but I would like just to emphasize the point that there are more and more mechanisms to mobilize financial flows, and it's very important to understand more about how they work and what are the challenges, again, to access. This is also to show you, just it's a very brief list in terms of what are the mechanisms that exist, but it's also important to say that a lot of, let's say, a lot of these mechanisms also work through implemented agencies and institutions. This means that sometimes there is a triangulation of mechanisms. For instance, in the Green Climate Fund, it is important to have like national determined national focal points to access to these funds. So it is very interesting to see that there are more and more institutions and agencies to implement a lot of the projects that are related to these financial mechanisms. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to show you the complexity and the number of agencies that are related to this architecture around the world. But before going to the challenges and the actual, recommendations to increase the access to these funds, I wanted to emphasize one of the critical discussions around the world that is, we are talking about the incremental, let's say, flows related to climate finance, but one of the discussions now is not only about the number, it's not only about the quantity of financial flows that are going around, but it's an understanding on to what extent these financial flows are tackling the needs of developing countries, not only at the governmental, central government, but also at the subnational level. I just wanted to show you this graph. Last year, the Standing Committee on Finance in the UNCCC published the first report on needs related to climate action in developing countries. And according to this report, the climate finance needs of developing countries are more or less estimated in $5.8 trillion between 2020 and 2030. This is more or less 589 billion per year in terms of needs. But this estimation has been updated according to Aviva investors. The actual needs in developing countries to really invest in climate action is around 780 billion per year. And why I want to emphasize this is because nowadays we are discussing the necessity to increase these financial flows, but more and more the analysis related to access and related to the allocation is also related to needs. To what extent these flows are covering needs, and to what extent these needs have been good, estimated in a comprehensive way in developing countries. And this is an important point that I'm going to emphasize just now. But in terms of how the financial flows have been covering financial needs, I just wanted to provide this example. According to the needs, to the NDR, the necessity or the needs are around 589 billion per year. But just in 2020, OECD countries transferred to non-OECD countries 79 billion. This is only 13% of what is actually needed around the world. This means that, yes, there is a massive gap between what is needed and what has been flowing. And then that's why we have to talk not only about how to access and how to improve the access, but also to what extent there are enough resources to cover all the needs that exist in developing countries. As you see, as you can imagine, there is, yes, an architecture to tackle climate change, and particularly from the financial side, but there are challenges to access to these financial mechanisms. Sometimes, and particularly for developing countries and with limited capacities, this can be very bureaucratic processes. Sometimes there are language barriers. Most of these mechanisms operate in English, for instance, and not all the countries have English as their first language. Obviously, there is a cost of access. Sometimes countries have to invest not only 1 or 2 years to access to these mechanisms, which really implies that they need human and economic capacities to proceed, to present projects and to really ensure that they access or that they comply with the due diligence of these mechanisms, which is extremely time consuming. And sometimes there is this mismatch between the needs in developing countries and the existing flows that exist around in the world. Of course, sometimes there are lack of understanding in what is the impact that these projects will have at the national and subnational level. And we believe that there is another limitation related to the actual knowledge and understanding about the existing mechanisms and the instruments that exist to implement these mechanisms. Of course, there are limited funds to transform. As you know, the climate action is very expensive. When we talk about loss and damage, it's not always easy to understand how much is needed and therefore how much has to be mobilized. And a lot of countries are aiming to access to grants, and most of the time the money available is in terms of loans, which creates at the end of the day a debt for the countries and the cities and the states when they try to access. And of course, there are institutional limitations in terms of capacity. And of course, there are other issues related to the triangulation of funds. But what can help us to build not only, I don't want to call it a bankable project, but rather an impactful project. There are a lot of elements that can help us to build these type of projects. And the first point is how to really estimate the cost of action. It's really important to analyze a little bit deeper how these interventions that we are going to create, what is the cost, the real cost, as well as the incremental cost. Sometimes it's going to be very difficult to find one source that will cover all the needs, but it is important to determine what is the cost to provide a guidance to the financial mechanisms. It is very important to determine the goals and the priorities, not only at the sectorial, but subsectorial level. For instance, more and more funds are trying to identify those funds or those projects that have cross-cutting impacts, that, for instance, not only working in energy, but in transport, or how there are synergies between different sectors. And also it's very important to determine what is the impact at the geographic level, not only at one specific point, but to what extent the interventions that we'll create will also have impacts at the regional level. More and more funds are looking for impactful mechanisms or projects that have like a multiplier effect across the regions. And of course, it is very important to determine the benefits, not only the social and the economic and the environmental benefits, not only in the quantity, but also on the quality side. For instance, what are the positive and the negative externalities as well? And this is something that financial mechanisms are looking like, what are those real benefits? Of course, a lot of mechanisms are looking for scalability, to what extent these projects can scale beyond not only in size, but also in scope, and replicability, like how one project can really be implemented in other areas. And finally, these points are very important. One project really needs to be how to improve the potential creation of partnerships to ensure the sustainability of these projects in the time, and also ensure the ownership and engagement with different stakeholders at the national level. And of course, it is very important to really create like institutions or institutional capacities to access to all these financial mechanisms. I just wanted to emphasize, for instance, in the case of Mexico, we organized a landscape, like understanding the national financial architecture, not only in terms of mechanisms, but also in terms of actors. What are the stakeholders that are providing support in terms of climate finance? And based on this, we developed a national strategy on climate finance at the different levels. And I just wanted to show you as an example that is very important for the financial mechanisms, particularly the public ones, to understand that all the money that they are providing respond to national strategies, that they really understand what are those priorities. And not only thinking in the short term, but also in the medium and the long term. So all those projects that have long-term impact are those that really are going to be more successful, because what the financial mechanisms want to ensure that whatever money they are investing will last not only in 1 year, but also can have this, as I was saying, multiplier effect in the future. So I just wanted to emphasize this case. I'm very happy to also like comment, and sorry that it's very small time, it's a short time to express all the elements. We're very happy to continue the conversation. So I'm gonna leave it here. Thank you so much, Julian.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sandra. I know we spoke earlier about this. Sandra was saying that normally I hope you can see this again. Sandra was saying that normally she, teaches on one of the courses, and this is a 3-month course. So we've just given her the impossible task to condense everything into 10 minutes. And thank you very much for taking us up on the challenge, and also sharing, your perspective and your knowledge and expertise on this topic with us. As you said, there's a lot more to cover, and this is probably just a glimpse into the topic, but we're hoping that this has given everybody a little bit of a flavor and an idea of where some of the sources might be, and what some of the questions might be also to think about. I'm very glad that we also have with us Loiso Mkwana, who is the Chief Director from the Gauteng Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, GDARD. Loiso brings 20 years of experience in environmental management, focusing on environmental policy, planning and coordination. And he has brought him to work on climate policy development, mainstreaming and execution, spatial mapping of climate corridors, vulnerability for current and future developments based on both socioeconomic demands, but also climate outlooks. And his work has been focused on institutionalizing different climate change into provincial strategies, and also key regional infrastructure, focusing on energy, transport, waste and adaptation approaches that has taken into consideration long-term adaptation scenarios for the region. Loiso, I'm really glad that you could join us, and also that you could share a little bit of GDARD's project on waste management, and give our participants here a bit of a challenge, looking for recommendation and some suggestions on your project. But Loiso, I'll hand over to you to let you go through the presentation.
Thank you, Julian. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to speak about an integrated waste management facility that we plan to do. Next slide. Next slide, we can move on that. So just the strategic planning framework for the country in blue and the province in green. 7 priorities for the country, but at a provincial or regional level, 7 as well. And the one being sustainable development for future generations. Next slide. Just now expanding a little bit on that priority 7 for the region, Gauteng, which is sustainable development for future generations. There are 3 key priority areas on ecological infrastructure, energy and water, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. If one expands a little bit more on that, under 7.3, you have water resource, alternative energy, as well as recycling and waste management. Next slide. Just a little bit about South Africa and waste picture. We high middle income economy, 60.14 citizens, highest urbanization rates probably in the world, one of the highest. But we in the smallest province that contributes to 33% to GDP and 43% to manufacturing contribution. Rapidly urbanizing region with a very high rate of population that is driven by in-migration. Next. If we look into the waste picture in this country, very much determined by a linear approach to resource management, generate more than 122 million tons per annum, of which 45 is in the smallest area. Remember, I said Gauteng is only about 1.8% of the land mass of SA. The downside is that we only recycling and recovering only about 10% of waste, but the upside is that there is a huge informal sector that is an appetite to participate in the diversion and reuse and recycling. The project that we will speak more in detail is within 3 metropolitan municipalities, the biggest in the country as well in the region, who are rapidly running out of landfill space. Next slide. Just a synopsis of the waste policy within Gauteng and what we want to achieve. We operate within a country that has got relatively new legislation framework. But however, this framework is quite clear that we must promote integrated waste management planning with clear objectives. We must promote recycling. We must regulate as a region harmful waste activities, and that we must promote a regional approach to waste management. The new integrated waste management plan of the country promotes circular economy, waste beneficiation, job creation, and SME development. To this extent, the minister responsible for environment in the country has promulgated regulation on extended producer responsibility. And recently, we've had the carbon tax coming into effect. We think that this is useful towards diversion, minimization, and economic leveraging of waste. Because if you don't, then the carbon tax is going to bite you. Just for Gauteng, in that context, we've been set a target to reduce waste, the 45% of 122 by 25% and develop a zero waste plan by 2030. In order to support this ambitious dream, we need to do a bit of a hard power, which is the regulatory element to mandate separation at source. However, we think it's critical for these kind of projects also to measure whether we are achieving the 25% reduction to develop and upgrade the Gauteng waste information system. That system already exists. We're upgrading it for improved waste data collection, which is useful for reporting, planning, and regulation. Further, as I've indicated, we've got a significant informal waste sector in the province. The department supports per annum 200 waste cooperatives. We train them on technical aspects of waste management, including the safety, hazardous nature, toxicity, all those elements, but also the economic opportunities that resides in waste management. So we register them with the Department of Trade and Industry, and a small number we support with infrastructure like your crushers, balers, industrial scale. So really, we have a waste policy that supports the project that we want to do. Next slide. So what do we want to achieve with this integrated waste management facility? So by its own nature, it's an integrated facility. So it's not just a facility for recycling or recovery. So we're looking at recovery, which is your alternative waste treatment technologies. We're looking into recycling, which is your composting, and then the recovery of domestic non-hazardous waste. So this is probably going to be a state-of-the-art facility that we think is integral to achieving the long-term plan for Gauteng of diversion of more than 25%. As I indicated, we're currently at only 10% of waste that's being recycled in Gauteng. We've already done the concept, has been approved by the 3 metros as a state-of-the-art facility that we will develop in phases to achieve not just environmental sustainability, but a reduction of pollution, as well as provide Gauteng with an affordable waste management system. Why do we want to do this facility? To promote minimization and prevention, promote recycling, and then promote waste to energy or volume reduction technologies, which I've already spoken to. The design objectives of the facility will consider the following: the maximization of energy recovery. So there will be alternative waste treatment technology or plant within the facility. The minimization of environmental impact. Here we're looking into not just the reduction on land contamination by landfilling, but also the waste that we can recover, including reuse of that waste for secondary and tertiary recyclable materials. We're hoping to maximize the use systems resilience in terms of the design of the facility and the modular approach that the facility will be designed to integrate not just waste, but also energy as well as water nexus or cross-cutting benefits. Of course, we're looking for optimization of land use because, as I've said, we are the smallest province, but we are tasked with growing the economy and we face immigration. So we don't have land for landfilling. And of course, we wanting that the facility collocates with future waste water treatment plant for the purposes of materials handling, energy, and water synergies. The facility will be developed as a joint project, as I've indicated, by the 3 biggest cities in South Africa, being Johannesburg, Tshwane, former Pretoria, and Ekurhuleni. And therefore, we have to, because these 3 independent metros have to set up a special purpose vehicle to jointly plan, design, and approve the project. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Loiso, for sharing this big challenge with us. Actually, it sounds it's this case of this project that you're that you're wanting to get funding for and get off the ground. So we really appreciate the openness to coming here and sharing it. And before we jump into our breakout rooms, I just wanted to ask everybody on the call just to take a minute or 30 seconds just to feel free to switch off your cameras and close your eyes and just think a minute. What are some of the images or reflections that come up for you? And what are some of the questions that are evoked as you've been listening to Loiso and to his presentation on this case of this challenge of this waste management project? So just take a minute to think about what are some of the images and reflections that come up. What are some of the questions that are evoked? Great. Thank you, everybody. And please take those reflections, the images, the questions that have come up for you, take them into your breakout room discussions. You'll have 25 minutes in breakout rooms in a minute, where you'll be spending time in groups of 4 to 5 participants. These groups have been selected by language, so hopefully you'll be able to speak the language that you feel most comfortable in. And we're wanting to ask you to introduce yourselves with your name and where you're calling from, but also then to discuss with each other what are some of the funding streams, maybe from Sandra's presentation, that might be most suitable for the state government of Gauteng and to GDART, and why. And what could GDART, Gauteng, do to strengthen their proposal and really make it bankable or impactful, as Sandra said? What are some of the critical questions and or maybe indicators that Gauteng could think about to make their proposal more impactful? You'll have a facilitator with you in the room to help you guide you through these questions. Please be prepared to share one recommendation or one suggestion for Loiso and his team later in plenary. So decide who's going to share that with us in plenary afterwards. But for now, I'm going to check in with TJ if we're ready to go into our breakout rooms. Let me stop sharing the screen really quickly so that I can see all of you and TJ. If we're ready to go into the breakout rooms, then I'll let you go and we'll see you back here in 20-25 minutes. Enjoy the conversation. Hi, welcome. We'll also continue to record this so that we'll be able to share this later. There is interpretation available again, so please do choose a channel again in English or in Spanish, how you'd want to continue following. And thank you very much for the time in breakout rooms. Just a quick note to Matthews. Thank you for your question on Sandra's presentation. We'll try to come back to that in the chat here, or alternatively, we might also respond to it afterwards in a follow-up email. But I'd be really interested to hear from everybody in the breakout rooms what you discussed and what some of the recommendations are or suggestions are that you've come up to for Loiso and his team. So I'm going to invite one person from each room, and I'm going to ask to just give 2 minutes, not spend more, but just to have 2 minutes to share one recommendation or one suggestion of what the government of Gauteng and Loiso and his team could be doing to make this proposal more impactful and bankable and get it to work. Okay, so I wanted to ask, can we maybe have somebody from breakout room 1? I think breakout room 1, I think we've had Federica, who was our facilitator there. I don't know if you appointed someone, or maybe Federica, if you want to come in otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I was in, yeah, exactly. Yeah, very happy. I'm not sure if anyone from my room wanted to jump in. Maybe I don't want to like spotlight anyone, but just giving this opportunity. So feel free to jump in if that's the case.
Go for it, Federica.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we discussed, actually it was very interesting because I feel like different participants kind of gave complementary answers actually. So we thought about like the situation and how they can access it, referring to the question number 1. Different participants agreed on the fact that adaptation and my mitigation funding can be probably accessed in both cases. Adaptation because all countries are facing unprecedented circumstances in many regions, so probably there's opportunity to access both funding streams. And then we also focused on a lot on how to make the proposal stronger and make it more bankable. So different governments underline the involvement of scientific teams that can produce data-driven evidence from previous projects and also especially when it comes to like pilot project, to make the proposal more solid, scalable, and also prove how they can be reproduced and scaled up in different circumstances and to larger areas, referring to similar challenges probably in other like provinces within the same country, or maybe also in neighboring countries that are facing similar challenges. That also another aspect that was brought up was to specify how much time and like be very clear on cost and relating to the project, and how to show benefits that it can be also carried on upstream, and how these benefits can be expanded to different facilities and different like initiatives that can be carried on maybe in a second phase of a project.
Right. I'm going to stop you there, if that's okay, just because we've got a few other rooms to get through, and I think those were already a lot of really great points that you mentioned. Thank you so much, Federica, for sharing those, and also for giving that as a snapshot of different recommendations for Louisa and his team. Maybe I can go to maybe I can jump to the next breakout room just to hear from. I think we've had Louisa and his team in one breakout room with Marie-Claire. I don't know, Marie-Claire, if you chose anyone who could speak, or maybe otherwise, please feel free to go for it and share your thoughts on what you discussed.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share what we discussed. A lot of, so we had people from Jammu and Kashmir in India, someone from North Bank region, the Gambia, and KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and Louisa himself from Gauteng. So yeah, an interesting discussion. A few people agreed that it would be good to locate it within the Global Climate Fund. And then we also discussed the importance of knowing the impact of the project and really communicating that to funders, which was, the main point I think that people will take away from Sandra's presentation today. But then, in terms of just practicality, we highlighted the importance of timing, and how that can just be a really big factor in determining the success of the project. It can delay it. So yeah, just keeping an eye on deadlines, and making sure that you have the right people, the capacity to undergo the procedures and documentation involved in implementing a project.
Right. Thank you so much, MC, for sharing those recommendations, suggestions to Louisa and his team. And I know that he's been already also on your group. I'll go next to the next breakout room to hear a bit from breakout room 3, I think it was. I don't know, Fariel, if you had anyone else who wanted to come in from your room, or if you want to give a couple of words.
Sure, Julian, I can go ahead. So we had a very diverse room from participants from African region and also from the Latin American region. And so we had a very productive discussion, and it's really hard to maybe pick one of the questions or one suggestion, but I'll do my best. So the question that emerged was that investors, they are mainly keen to look into the mid to long-term returns. And so they need to have a little bit assurance that a project should map different stakeholders and how they are going to contribute to the project. So the question that has emerged, I mean, after listening to the presentation, it wasn't quite clear, but we would really like to ask Louisa and the team whether they have already done the stakeholder mapping or not. So that's the question. In terms of the suggestion, I think the idea is that one suggestion that came up very strongly is that the GDOT team should develop a strategy around measuring the outcomes and impacts, and particularly ways in which they can monitor and measure the impacts. So that's the suggestion from our room. Thank you, Julian.
Great. Thank you very much, Faria, for taking us through that. And I come maybe to our next room. I think we had a Spanish-speaking room. Estefi, I think you were in this room. Maybe you can come in, or I don't know if there was somebody else from your room who wanted to share a couple of recommendations.
Sure, Julian, thank you. We were with Sandra, so that was very enriching. And we had participation from people from Peru, from Brazil, from Mexico, as some of our team members. So in conclusion, the national development banks play a very important role as they have more advantages than other financial sources. For example, they provide certainty and long-term continuity. And then it's easier for subnational governments to reach for these resources rather than doing this triangulation to reach international financial mechanisms via other sources like the Green Climate Fund, for example. Also, that the role of public-private association is very important as these financing sources have an equity element and earning profit is on their mandate. So this also strengthens the scalability element. And finally, that achieving a successful engagement with different stakeholders, such as developers from the private sector, civil society, and academia is key to strengthen these efforts. So it was very, very interesting to hear that.
Perfect, great. Thank you so much for sharing those, Steffi, from your group. And last but not least, I'm going to come to the last breakout room. Jebby, maybe you want to come in and just share a couple of reflections or suggestions and recommendations that were discussed in your group.
Thanks, Julianne. Well, our group was mostly comprised of colleagues from Gauteng. So actually we heard more about the challenge, and we also had colleagues from Paraná in Brazil. But yeah, just really understanding the challenge a bit more, how, you know, they didn't have the budget at the province level, they didn't have it at the metro level. And when they approached national government, it was also a case of doing a pre-feasibility study. So one thing that was kind of mentioned was being a member of the Under2 coalition, they were able to apply to the Future Fund and get a bit of budget to start that process. So that's been helpful. And in Paraná, they mentioned that in addition to being a member of the Under2 coalition, they've also joined Regions 4 precisely again to kind of get this support on how to access international funding. So I think we talked about a bit of that experience that coalitions like the Under2 have. Ours is mostly in sort of bilateral funding. For example, this project is funded by the German government, but how rigorous those funding processes are and how much we need to have in place in order to apply for them, and having that kind of budget and value for funding was really important. And then I guess for Gauteng, just one thing that would be really helpful, because we didn't have such a diverse group, is having that sort of targeted peer-to-peer learning. So really identifying other sort of states and regions that are grappling with this particular issue of integrated waste management systems and so forth. And I think sort of there were some regional approaches they mentioned in the Netherlands, but sort of identifying those other examples from around the world where they could learn from. And yeah, again, bringing them into a bit more of a focused discussion around that would be really helpful. But yeah, hopefully they've gained from some of the recommendations in the other rooms. But yeah, just to bear that in mind sort of going forward as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jebby. And I appreciate everybody for kind of doing this really quickly and sharing these different recommendations. I think I've heard something about looking at different schemes that have worked in different contexts, and learning from other projects, and kind of maybe looking at data from other projects, really thinking about timing and determining, to have a really successful project, thinking about the mid and long-term returns as well, and maybe doing a stakeholder mapping to understand how do we strengthen really the efforts from the different stakeholders that are involved or affected by this project. Maybe developing one of the other recommendations, if I were in your position to, develop a strategy to measure the outcomes and also the impact, and maybe to think about how do we strengthen that scalability of the project, and learning from our peers. I mean, this is where a space like this is also for having a peer forum. But I'd like to actually turn to Luiso and almost come to a conclusion and start closing the case, because Luiso and his team, I think Jebby already started talking about that. Luiso and his team have worked with the Under2 coalition and have also received a bit of support and technical assistance there. So it'd be interesting to hear what are the changes that you made in the end to your project, and how have you strengthened the impact of it? Luisa, over to you.
Thank you. I must say that it's been a quite insightful sessions, and the feedback is amazing. Just on conclusion, so the kind of these projects that we will do in the past would have been funded entirely by the state or by the municipalities. So we've changed our approach, the development approach, that we will have to crowd in private sector funding. The initial estimates at this stage is around about South African rands to the tune of 400 million minimum. And that, of course, it's got to comply with national legislation and regulations on how then do you crowd in that private finance through a private public finance framework within the country. The second part is that because we now need to mobilize the private sector finance, and part of this, of course, there's also we could mobilize public finance to further strengthen the case for the project in terms of the feasibility. So we're looking into the National Treasury for funding for comprehensive feasibility. So instead of designing the project with funds at the end, we're beginning this project with no funds at all, and developing an approach that's different, because there's upset that the municipalities spend their money landfilling, and you're not going to say to them overnight, stop landfilling. You do have to sell the project, fund it, and then slowly replace the landfilling. So for this reason, we're going to take the project in phases. We just done now the concept phase, as I've indicated. We've developed a strategic plan for the project. We're going to undertake the next two steps, which is the admin part. And then we've already started with phase two, which is the pre-feasibility. And we helpful for the funding that we've received through under two coalition technical support, a funding of $25,000 from Future Fund, which then we're going to use for the pre-feasibility. You know, in our breakaway, there was a very, very clear emphasis on bankability of the project and developing that case. I think also there were comments that our project at this stage is not clear on designs and the costing. And we must say that we're still at a very early stage of the project, just done the phase one. And the feasibility will then deal with the preliminary designs and the detailed design, as well as then the costing part. And then phase three is really then the procurement phase. And I'm not going to go through the bullets. Some of them are just statutory, processes in South Africa, which I shouldn't bother anybody about, except that we're probably going to look into blended finance. We might look into public, and private finance. In other words, that if we receive funding from the international and national climate instruments, we could use that to de-risk the project and still get a private investor or funders to just share the risk from this project. What we're looking into once we have sourced a funder, we're looking into a model where the project will be developed on finance, design, build, manage, operate a model. And then that requires probably one is looking into a long-term concession agreement, and that the municipalities will still contribute to the design and construction cost. Hence, I was then talking to the public-private. So the municipalities will probably still carry some cost, but we're also looking into institutional, funding mechanisms like GCF and the GEF. If you can look at the next slide. Yes, I think I've presented on this slide. We're looking at government finance from Treasury, local government. What are we looking into? The potential funders, it's a suite of them. We've lucky that some of our colleagues have worked at the World Bank and are quite familiar with the funding requirements. We're looking into, there was a proposal, I think, from the Spanish group on national development banks. For us, it's called the Development Bank of South Africa. Also the African Development Bank, including, of course, the BRICS Bank, but also we're looking across in terms of the European Investment Bank, European Bank, and as broad as Latin America. Next slide. Including the Asian community. I think this sort of slide is our experience when we've knocked at the doors of the funders. As we've said, we've already spoken to Development Bank, we've spoken to the Industrial Development Corporation, we've spoken to the public sectors, which is the municipalities. So these are the questions, you know, and some of the questions are reflections from the breakaways. You know, are we clear about the estimated capital costs and long-term operational implications? I think Dr. Sandra spoke about the impact of the project to funders. How are we going to attract additional funding? Does the project, is it viable on its own, or it will depend on ongoing funding from the state? Is it in line with regional and national government, which is why we spoke a little bit in the beginning about the South African scenario and the Gauteng waste policy. Does it help to on the NDC? Absolutely. We spoke about the waste sector being 16% of GHG emissions within the region. Is it aligned with the SDGs? Again, we have to answer that question. What we're looking into immediately is the sustainable goal on the SDG goal on sustainable production and consumption. Yes, we want to get in the private sector stakeholders to support the project. As I've just indicated, the funding that we've received through under two coalition technical support from Future Fund, we're using to undertake the technical feasibility studies. The first one is the pre-feasibility, and then we will move into the next round, which is a comprehensive feasibility through funding from Treasury. Have the risks been considered? Of course, funders want to know, have you done a proper risk, including the fact that it's 3 independent municipalities, will they always cooperate? What happens if there's internal conflict amongst themselves? No, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Loiso. I very much appreciate you solving and closing this case for us, and interesting to hear what you'll be taking away. I know that we're slightly over, so I'm going to skip our reflections for today, but what I will do is I'm going to really quickly let you know that we have our next peer forum coming up on the 18th of October. It's a Tuesday, and we'll be looking at how to use satellite data to strengthen climate actions, but also reporting. And we'll be hearing from the Climate Footprint Project, but also from the STARS project, which is another under 2 coalition project. And for now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I would love for everybody to come put your video on, feel free to unmute yourself, just to give a big round of applause to our 2 speakers, to Loiso and Sandra, and a big thank you and a big goodbye, and see you next time. Feel free to speak in whatever language you want to say.
Parabéns. Congratulations.
Obrigado.
Bye. Merci. Bye.
Obrigado.
Bye bye.
Obrigado.
Ciao. Adios.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye is a global word. Bye is a global word. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you. will be
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a good rest of the day.
Yeah,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Goodbye. Feel free to leave the meeting. Otherwise, we'll be closing the room.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Happy. Have a good day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Luiso. Thank you very much.
Bye, guys. Thank you. Great job, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Steffi. Bye.
Are we going to stay here
We
or
are-
are we going to
yeah.
jump to the Teams?
Happy to stay here quickly. We can probably stop the recording.
Okay.
And then just